Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. Two questions, one for Ganesh and one for Jody. I'd like to question Ganesh's assertion that it started in East Asia because of luck. I don't think it started in East Asia, and I don't think it was luck. I mean, yes, if you go back to the 18th century, when people were sending porcelain out to be painted in China, you can say that that was the beginning and Asia started it. But sticking to the last 50 years, it started with the US and Mexico. It then was the US and the Caribbean. It then was the US and Southeast Asia. It then was Japan and Southeast Asia. And then it built on from then. So I think you have to explain, to quote the title of a book published already in the 1980s, why the emperor's new clothes are not made in Colombia. Why did it move from Latin America to Asia? And that wasn't luck, and it wasn't nearness or anything of the sort, because Latin America is still just as near to the US as it was in the 1960s. And I really would like you to develop more on what you said about skills, about what you said about the infrastructure, and maybe the relations between the countries as well as the companies. But I think that there must be explanations in there, because it's actually a lot harder to come in second on something like this. And Asia not only came in second, it wiped the floor with everyone else. So if Africa is going to try to replace Asia, or if some of the countries like Nepal in Asia that aren't in it yet are going to try to replace the leaders, we have to know what you can do to move, to displace the leaders. And this actually, I mean, the clothes example brings me to Jody's thing. Do we need to separate out clothes and textiles and that sort of value chain from the others? I mean, that they do seem to be particularly poor if you want to upgrade. It's particularly hard, or maybe there are others that are particularly good. But I don't think you can ignore what the value chain is in. And a value chain in tourism, to take France's example, is not the same as a value chain in clothes. And I can't think of any real examples of countries that have done it from clothes. I mean, arguably Malaysia, but they got into electronics pretty quickly. If you just stick to clothes, you're not going, the nature of the market is always going to be end-led. So is it worth asking which industries, not just what state you are in the chain?
Okay, Indirect and then, sorry.
Thank you. Picking up on, let me first thank all the speakers. I think Ganeshan's presentation was excellent. Thank you very much, and all the other contributions for their valuable insights. Picking up on Sheila's point about, why, I think one can say that East and Southeast Asia took it to a new level. It may have started elsewhere, but it took it to a new level. And trying to understand that, and I think I subscribe to Ganeshan's view that it was luck and a set of circumstances. And I think one of the unintended consequences of the Plaza and Louvre Accords, and then the sharp appreciation of the yen, was, of course, Japan exporting capital. Because I recall in the 80s, in fact, the Japanese had what they called the Asian industrialization strategy, and they identified 4 countries: Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. And I recall them coming to Sri Lanka and talking to Sri Lanka about this. And of course, Sri Lanka missed out because of the ethnic conflict. But the other countries, if you look at the mid-80s, there's a step jump in terms of their economic trajectory. And it was Japanese investment and the value chains that created it. So to some extent, it was a managed process. And so the question is, okay, if you are going to replicate it, okay, the business costs, the trade costs, all that is important, the liberalization is important, but you may well have to manage it again. So the question, I've been living in Sri Lanka the last 4 years, and the question one constantly asks is, why hasn't this happened in South Asia? And some of the, I think, answers were given by Yurendra, which, all the NTBs, the infrastructure, transit, all that is there. But I'm somewhat more optimistic, because I think there's a moment to be seized in South Asia, because there could be another opportunity to manage this process, because one of the change in India's attitude, the whole Modi orientation towards manufacturing and towards growth, the Modi orientation towards the neighborhood, the understanding that for India to achieve its global ambitions, it needs stability and prosperity in the region. Of course, things are getting confused by what's happening in Pakistan and this Al-Qaeda unit, etc. But, the basic thrust of the whole Indian policy at the moment, I think, creates an opportunity to manage such a process again, a similar kind of process. Clearly, the Nepals and the Sri Lankas have got to do some of the liberalization plus, but I think it's now in India. See, when India had its first growth surge, the region didn't benefit at all. Now, this time around, the question is, can one recreate some of the conditions that happened in East and Southeast Asia, in South Asia? And I must say I'm somewhat optimistic. There's a heck of a lot of things that have to be done. But I do think it can be replicated. You need to do the policies, but you also need to manage the process as, it happened in East and Southeast Asia.
Okay.
Thank you. And they started with regional and then went global. If you look at that process, it was regional and then
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rachel Noble. I'm from ActionAid UK. Thanks, everyone. Really interesting presentations. I think the Cambodia example is really interesting because it also draws attention to questions of how women benefit from global value chains, because 90% of the women of workers in Cambodia's garment industries, I'm sure Jodie knows, are actually women. But I think it's also important to highlight that as much as the industry there has created thousands of new jobs, there are still very significant challenges in terms of wages and working conditions. So just earlier this year, there were mass strikes and demonstrations where 6 protesters were actually killed, 23 were detained, only released in May. The majority of women are now on short-term contracts in the garment industry, which denies them access to key social benefits, including maternity protection and leave. And the just-in-time production model is driving the formal factories to use informal factories, which fall outside the purview of labour monitoring mechanisms like the ILO's Better Factories Cambodia initiative, which was linked to the multi-fibre agreement arrangement. So as well as just wanting to draw attention to those important points to bear in mind and draw thoughts back a little towards the workers in these global value chains and how they benefit or not. I also wanted to ask, let's hear a bit more from Jodie actually about her thoughts around how industrialisation policy in Cambodia and FDI policy could be shaped in a way to try and mitigate some of these challenges. Thank you.
Okay, so these are the first 3 questions, and now we come back to the audience in a minute. So a couple of questions about, so we need to dig deeper in terms of explanations, and we need to go further down into history. So Ingrid's point about we can replicate versus your one, it's difficult to replicate. Can we seize the moment? Can South Asia seize the moment? China needs to shed 80 million jobs. Can it take some? Can't it do the same as other East Asian countries did, and take some of those jobs? And a series of questions about Cambodia as well, in terms of whether the workers benefit, how they benefit. So let's go first to Ganesh, then to Jodie, and then maybe to Frans and Jurgen.
Thank you very much. This is interesting. The question of replicability, I think there's a first mover advantage for countries that get in early. And then what they do is they not only create the competitiveness in their industry, particularly getting the small and medium enterprise more linked to these chains, so the benefits start spreading, but also in terms of upgrading to allied industries and related industries. So this first mover advantage is very much there. But of course, as the costs rise, the simpler industries and the simpler tasks are available for others to get into. And this Chinese case that you talked about with Ethiopia, I thought was very interesting, one where you get a lead firm, but don't forget the Chinese model is also with a lot of foreign aid behind it, and it's also arguably these test cases are seen very importantly, so a lot of resources are put around it to make it work, and I'm wondering whether that would survive under pure market conditions. So that kind of case is very much an issue. So I think others can enter, but they can enter segments. And it might just be, the odd firm or the odd bit of production, but that can make a huge impact in terms of the industries in which they are. In terms of Sheila's point, I think Sheila's probably right. Latin America was in it, but arguably even Europe was in this even earlier. So it depends what we mean by a value chain and when we get into it.
I mean, actually, exporting semi-processed, the ingredients of a television, assembling them in Sinaloa and sending them back to the U.S.
Right.
Made legal in '66 by the U.S.
Right.
And I don't think there were, I mean, no doubt there was the odd example, but it wasn't on an industrial scale.
Well, right. So one way to think about this is, of course, the Mexican Maquiladora case and the U.S. thing. No question about that. It was cross-border trade in this type of parts and components. But some people say the Italians did this in the industrial districts within their own country. And there might have been something.
I think this is the point I would make. I think the U.S. did it from New England to the South first, and therefore it was, in a sense, easier for a U.S. producer than for a British producer
Right.
who hadn't had the experience of producing at a distance.
Right. Exactly. So in my own presentation, I was really talking about what happened in East Asia and led by the Japanese. I wasn't really talking about the global phenomenon that occurred, right? So that was just one clarification. That's why I didn't talk about Latin America and so on. But in general, I think one has to go into the history of industrialization to see how this occurred geographically. And indeed, the Latin American case is very important, and it stalled in Latin America, and East Asia now has wiped the floor with everyone else, and that's very clear. So I think just to be very clear on what I was trying to do, I think South Asia in the jet you raised is very, very interesting in terms of the moment that we're getting. This is where the luck factor comes in. Not only do you have Modi, who's very proactive in terms of business industrialization, but you have the Delhi-Mumbai corridor, this big industrial corridor in India, that the Japanese have been involved in for some time, and they're going to create this ultra-modern infrastructure with energy, transport, multimodal, and also JICA and JBIC are very involved in trying to make this a success. So the luck comes in. You have this kind of concerted effort with aid policy. The political moment comes in. With Mr. Modi's visit to Japan, hundreds of industrialists went from India, and there were lots of big meetings that occurred last week, and something will come of that. And then, of course, don't forget, India is also in this regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is linking with East Asia, and that's got a momentum and arguably stronger than the TPP. So luck, it depends what we define as luck, but I keep thinking these are conditions which are kind of created. The last point on Dirk Willems, what is this liberalization plus? And I can't resist. I mean, basically, what some countries in East Asia, particularly Korea, Taipei, China, the People's Republic of China, and bits of Thailand did was liberalization with lots of infrastructure and supply side things with industrial policy. Now, of course, that varied from country to country. And so they, in Korea in particular, they picked the chai ball, and then they put a lot of incentives around it. They put a lot of support, and they got that to export. In the case of Taipei, China, it was the small and medium enterprise, and they did the same sort of thing with a lot of credit, and the credit institutions were very strong. So there are different strategies within industrial policy. Now, whether anyone else can do what was done in East Asia is a really moot point, and a lot of it depends on the government capability. The stronger the capability you have to intervene, and the stronger the partnerships you have with the private sector, the more you can do some of those things. If you don't have that capability and those partnerships, then it's better to just create the enabling environment and liberalize, and then hopefully things upgrade, but you'll have more of a switch to agriculture and more of a switch to services, because that's what tends to happen. So I think a lot of it is those conditions. But let me just stop and let the others jump in.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, Malaysia, Thailand, at that initial stage, did they have the capabilities, say, of the Koreas and Thailand?
No, they didn't. And in Thailand in particular, which I have some sense of, there was an attempt to build some of that capability by sending people outside to learn. JICA and others had very good programs to do some of this. And then the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Thailand have tried. But you see, that strategy was more FDI-led. I mean, sorry, again, we could spend an entire lecture on what is industrial policy, and I hope one day we might do that. But that was an FDI-led strategy, as opposed to the Korea, Taipei, China, which was domestic firms. So you need much more industrial policy if you're going to do domestic firms, because the learning costs are very high.
But just in terms of that list that Yorenda mentioned about sort of the networking, so was there active public support for networking, much more than sort of the infrastructure and skills that we now know that is important for driving economic transformation. But was there, in addition to that, also public support for the networking,
right.
Getting firms together? Think about the sort of the Bangladesh case, where it started with somebody who went to Korea, learned the skills, then came back, and was supported by the public sector?
That's right. Okay, so the basic point is to get into value chains, no matter which way you do this, through the national industrial policy type process or the FDI strategy, you have to have links with foreign firms. And that occurs either through transnationals or through foreign buyers. And the Bangladesh case, so network is terribly important. Bangladesh case is the Desh and Devu case, which is very famous. Young Wee Ree, another person from the 80s, you may know Sheila, wrote about this case. And so the networking is fundamental, no matter which you do. Okay. Then the only argument is, do you intervene at a very fine level where you provide a lot of support, or do you intervene at a broader functional level and create the conditions for foreign investment? So that's the only argument, and I'm happy to come back to that liberalization plus at the end. But that's what I want to say. So the different types of strategy you might use.
Okay, Jodie, there was a couple of questions on Cambodia about where the workers benefit, female workers in particular.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on Sheila's point first, whether textiles and clothing can still be the first rung up the industrialization ladder. Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one. I mean, as we mentioned, Ethiopia in Africa has moved into shoes rather than textiles and clothing in a big way. It hasn't moved from Cambodia or Bangladesh. It's actually increased over time. And I mean, it is posited within the global value chain literature that it's going to be very hard to upgrade into that functional position anyway. And I haven't looked at intersectoral upgrading in either Cambodia or Bangladesh, but that would be interesting. I mean, I know that there are kind of anecdotal stories of shipbuilding in Bangladesh, so that's jumping into a completely different industry altogether. So yeah, and then on the question on the current situation in Cambodia, it is very challenging, and they've been going through a recent election process, and I think we just have to wait until the political settlement is right. I mean, I've read through the industrial policy documents at the moment, and they're very ambitious. There is a lot of focus on skills, workers' skills, training, and higher education as well, which is positive. But I think we have to wait for the political situation. And that story is also quite similar to Bangladesh, actually, as well. So.
Okay. On the Bangladesh case, by the way, the Desi case that you mentioned, we've got a sort of a video on our website, on the DFID ESG Growth Research Program website, where the daughter of the owner explains how her father basically started the company. So just have a look and, on the website. Frans and Jurenda, would you like to comment on the point?
One point is it replicable? In the OECD, you have started a program among a lot of different directorates, the Trade Directorate, the Industry Directorate, the Statistics Directorate, and we bring together a number of countries exactly to see if they can learn from each other and what we can learn from them. Of course, one of the most successful cases in Latin America is Costa Rica, which is very active in a number of value chains, medical equipment, tools, and so. It's a country which doesn't spend any money on defense, so it had to some money left to spend on education, but they did it very well. They spent very well on education, have good policy, and is extremely successful in this policy. I think Colombia is also trying to replicate what is being done. So yes, I don't subscribe to this idea that after Southeast Asia, the rest of the developing country is doomed forever and ever and ever.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah, thanks.
Jurenda?
Yeah, just 2 quick points. One, just a quick clarification, I think, because in that list when I was talking about, I'm not proposing that we should just leave it on autopilot. I'm just saying that you have to actively focus on your core constraints first, get that right, then you can go to your networking and all of that.
So there's a sequence.
Sequence to it. And I think I still question whether GVC makes it easier or is it harder? I think that we haven't touched on that because there's a sort of this assumption that going down the GVC path is easier than producing final product. And I am not wholly convinced that there's a straight, clear-cut answer to it. Second point on India. I completely agree, managed process. As a South Asian, I pray that India grows at 10% so it becomes generous to the rest of us. But I think and we're doing actually, I'm co-editing a volume with Razak. It's a Commonwealth volume on regional integration in South Asia and what the problems are and what needs to happen. But the problem, I think, for me, twofold. One is political. I think the region is still stuck in 1945 and hasn't been able to get off that. So lots of barriers. I think the way it's been structured is it doesn't want people and goods or anything to move around politically. And the second issue is that you've got, it's a very unique region where all the countries are connected via India. Apart from Pakistan and Afghanistan, I fail to have another regional example where all the member countries are connected to each other but through a single country. So it creates a very different dynamic in resolving regional issues. That is why we really need 10%. As South Asian neighbors, I really pray that India grows at 10% or more.
We need to see India as an opportunity rather than a threat.
Yes, yes.
Very good. Okay, let's go to a second set of questions, and I'm going to go first there before I come to the JICA representative. Over there on the right.
People give their names.
Yeah, could you say your name as well?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I'm Rachel Nicholson from the Department for International Development, and I've got 3 questions which are kind of related, and I'll try and keep really short. The first was around kind of economic growth and looking at value chains, kind of, I guess, a bit more from a poverty perspective. It's kind of clear that the trade figures have increased, but there's still obviously massive levels of poverty and inequality within some of these countries. I mean, China and India are the really obvious examples. Do we think that kind of income per capita is a good enough measure in terms of whether this is really kind of benefiting developmentally these countries, or should there be kind of more responsibility from donor countries or these organisations to kind of ensure that some of this trickles down more broadly and we're measuring that? The second point kind of links to the point made by the lady from ActionAid around kind of responsibility and corporate kind of social responsibility. In terms of ensuring, again, that exploitative practices aren't being used. The recent case from Bangladesh around health and safety and building collapses, like how much responsibility should there also be within this discussion for countries, both kind of where the multinational organisations are based, but also where they're operating, to kind of ensure this is more regulated. And finally, around the conditions for conditions for this. We've talked a lot about some of the preconditions in terms of like energy and infrastructure and other things, but I also wonder around some of the business environment constraints which the private sector organisations cited. So perhaps a bit more around kind of political stability, security in those countries, and corruption, which is probably tied up under the kind of business environment concerns. And kind of just want to challenge how much we should be kind of making sure that's wrapped up in this discussion as well.
Okay. Very good. 3 good, clear questions. The gentleman over there.
Hello, Jules Siedenberg. I'm a freelance consultant. Yeah, I just want to pick up on the example of Nepal as a country looking in from the outside that's landlocked and faces big transport constraints. Maybe it's a naive question, but would it be possible to focus on very small or high-value products? You could use air transport. I mean, how viable is that? Or is it a problem to try and start higher up the skills scale? Thank you.
Leapfrogging, yep. Lady here.
Well, I have 2 questions and then a general comment. So my first question is about the measurement of trade. I mean, it's very hard to measure global value chains, and there are different methods. So you propose, well, there is a lot of literature on using trading intermediates at the 6th level. However, that is a bit unbiased because, for instance, I did my research on value chains, and I was asking someone like a supplier in Mexico, And he was saying like, well, a cable can be an intermediate output, but also it can be a final product. So how to capture that? I mean, the best way probably is doing these surveys at the firm level and then ask companies, and there are some surveys available. So my question is, are you planning to do like a study using these firm level data rather than trade level data to reflect the magnitude of trading global value chains? Then the second question is for Jody. It's about, you say that it's very easy to enter into global value chains, but I think, I mean, you cannot assert that because probably for some value chains like garments, it can be easier, but in electronics, automobile industry, it's very hard to access. And also there are other things in the structure of the value chain like trust. For instance, with Japanese firms, it's very hard to enter into that value chain because they normally rely on Japanese clients. So, I mean, probably just like a clarification of that. And thirdly, well, I did some research on Mexico, and you have mentioned something about Mexico. So I was basically measuring the magnitude of value chains. Who are the firms who are integrated into these value chains? And is Mexico benefiting from these global value chains? So my global results were like, the country is not benefiting from global value chains because most of the firms integrated into these value chains are transnational corporations, and the value added is only the cheap labor of Mexico. So in terms of job creation, it's good. But in the long term, if you don't have an industrial policy that Mexico didn't have at that time, then there should be other things in place to upgrade. So there are some cases of maquiladoras and firms that upgraded, but probably you can count them with one hand. But there should be other things like also the regulation in the market. So you should control monopolies, because what happened in Mexico is that there is a lot of monopolies. Just you have one firm producing one component, and then the other firms who are small and medium enterprises, they cannot access this value chain. So I think we have to look at the broader perspective and the competition. And I mean, it can create opportunities, but also it can create some constraints for local firms who don't have the capacity to absorb these transaction costs.
Okay.
So,
which organization were you from?
I am from Carno Emerging Markets. My name is Fabiola.
Okay,
Lopez.
Thank you very much. You mentioned about it's difficult to enter Japanese value chain. So
yes.
there were two representatives from JICA, the JICA representative in Ethiopia. So maybe how can Ethiopia get into this?
Excuse me. My name is Kimiaki Jen. I used to be in London as a JICA representative in the UK, but now in Ethiopia. And just came from Addis this morning. And I'm very glad to participate in this very interesting simulating event. And regarding the first question about what is the factors to create the global value chain, well, liberalization and proactive industrial policy, and also a long process of skill and productivity development is my understanding. Well, in Ethiopia, as you said, that there are very active industrialization or promotion of FDI is ongoing, especially in the shoe sector. And what the government is doing is to create the industrial development zone and also provide the preferential condition to on the tax, and also supply of utilities such as water, power, and land. And also, of course, government is heavily investing in infrastructure development, especially in the road and railway transportation, because they are landlocked. But another point of the importance is that the accumulation or long term of skill and productivity development, because government of Ethiopia is prioritized textile as a number one light manufacturing industry. And leather is second, and metal industry and food agro-processing. But compared with textile, leather is much prominent because of the foundation they have. Well, even 10 years ago, we observed quite big accumulation of clusters of small, very small leather industries in Addis Ababa, which was very active and very dynamic, try to connect with Italian market and the European market. So based on those skills and also effort to develop the productivity, now laser industry attract this FDI. Otherwise, without certain level of skills and productivity, a foreign company will not invest. It will be very high cost. So that the domestic development of domestic industry is one of the foundation for the attraction of FDI. And that implies that we have to understand, we have to study more about the industrial development process in Asian countries, like competitiveness. And when we talk about the competitiveness cluster is one of the factors which can improve the productivity because of the low cost of transportation and communication, and also spillover of skills and knowledge, and probably system of contract enforcement because of the closeness. But this last point, so when we come into the globalization era, spillover of knowledge and probably communication can be improved by this global communication. But probably also important point is how we can strengthen the enforcement, contract enforcement mechanisms. So that is quite important to through, we have to develop this contract enforcement through fostering the trust. Somebody, even in Ethiopia, people often say that the Japanese decision-making process is very slow. But once they come, they will stay longer. So we are not really, not we, but the Japanese companies are not really deciding the strategy in the short term, but the very long term, like 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So such kind of things may also contribute to strengthen this global value chain mechanisms. So I'm very eager to introduce more about what we are doing in Ethiopia. Especially, we are promoting Kaizen approach, which focuses on the productivity and quality improvement of the manufacturing sector. And I hope we can significantly contribute to the Ethiopian economic growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So quite a range of questions here in this second round. I suppose the first question, maybe let's take as a cross-cutting issue, because it was also a question. It's in the title of the event, which is everyone benefiting? So it's not just whether those firms that enter in the value chain benefit, but also whether poor people inside, outside the firms actually benefit in the spillovers. And I don't know whether we can sort of elaborate on this. And I think you were the inventor of the title of the event, kind of. So you must be able to answer this. And then I'll also hope to sort of ask Jody on how the garment sector has affected the poverty rate in Cambodia, and sort of the effects of tourism on poverty in Nepal, and the extent to which donors should think more about value chain development, or whether they should focus on whether the poor benefit from value chain development.
Thank you very much, and for raising that issue, particularly on workers, and I think that's a very important issue. Okay, so factually, industrialization has provided benefits for workers over time, but in the initial phases isn't necessarily as good as we would like it, given in its raw form. The reason being, the competitiveness that can occur in these value chains is really linked to cost. And you have, from the point of view of a firm that is investing in different countries, to try to create the cheapest cost conditions if you want to stay in the business. And particularly if you're subcontracting this stuff out to further locations, you need, low cost is one aspect, second is reliability delivery, and secondly is this ability to produce at a certain price. So what typically happens is all the things that you mentioned unfortunately occur. Now, we can try as best as we can with CSR, and I think that's a good idea where possible. And we should try to do this. But if the costs get too high, firms may move. And there's little control over that process from donors. So it's really trying to trade off. I think where we can have the Nikes of this world that bring in good practices in some of these things, let's do it. Where we may not, let's try very hard over education and so on as best as we can, but very hard to regulate this stuff into being. The ILO conventions are very controversial, but we should try and strive. I mean, please, I'm being realistic about this, yeah? Because, if you ask poor people whether they want a job, and even if it's not a very good job, they'll say yes, rather than not being able to right to work if the industry isn't there. So this is the ultimate trade-off. So I think we have to be very realistic about this. Look, I'd love to be idealistic, but one has to be realistic. On the issue of measurement of party, I was just trying to show you some simple numbers which told a little story, and I'm still playing with the stats. And I hope to introduce other measures of quality of life and other things into those macro type of comparisons. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to plug my new book. It's called Production Networks and Enterprises, Industry and Firm Level Analysis. Springer will publish next year. Please read this and you'll learn about firm surveys and so on. No, but the serious point, sorry about the advertising. That may not invite me back. No, that's the subtitle, the firm level, because I couldn't. No, the serious point is measurement is very complicated. And I take a very eclectic view. I use the value-added approach to tell me whatever that tells me. I use the growth stage approach. And the value-added approach, the problem I find with that is that the input-output tables sometimes are a bit ropey. They're not comparable between countries and not up-to-date. So I have a problem with that, right? And I want to tell a high-frequency story, so I use the growth trade approach, which is what you saw on the chart. At least I get some kind of a story that tells me some high-frequency thing. And I use the firm surveys. However, to do what you're saying, which is to map, final goods versus intermediate, and then there's first tier versus second tier, and there's tertiary tier, and all this stuff, very complicated. That's just case study. And we don't capture the whole of the value or the whole of the thing. So, use the combination, tell the best story one can, right? And then, fingers. And it's going to be, I think even when we are all retired, including Yurendra and Jody, we'll still be debating measurement. So we do what we can. Let me stop there.
Jody, on governments and poverty, social responsibility.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the industry in Cambodia has contributed to poverty reduction. I just think that the level of poverty is not reduced as much as people had hoped. And there are new entrants, there's demographic changes as well that have to be taken into account. I think it was back in 2009 when we first looked at the industry in Cambodia, and at that time even the World Bank economists were quite concerned the fact that the economy was so skewed towards one industry. And they were actually arguing that there was a need to go back to look at the agricultural sector and so on. So that was back in 2009. So I think policymakers have recognised that yes, the garment industry has got a role for reducing poverty through employment, women's employment, and so on. But that's not the only sector of the economy that should be playing that role. So efforts have also focused elsewhere. And just to follow up on the point of Mexico and global value chains, my point really is that all countries are within a global value chain of some kind. It's just what kind you're in, and then how are you learning, upgrading, and so on. And the nature of relationships with investors is a very important one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yurendra, you wanted to chip in?
Sure.
Tourism.
Yeah, I think 2 quick points. First one on income inequality and labor standards issues. I think Nepal is it's an amazing observation field at the moment, because you get 400,000 people entering the labor market each year, 400,000 people leaving the country each year, and they're all pursuing one goal: jobs, and to increase income. And I think on that basis alone, I think income is very, very important. But I also think that development policy shouldn't be about choices or trade-offs. We can have all of it. Inequality should be improved. We should have more income should be increased. So it shouldn't be that you can have one but not the other. And I often remember this very famous saying by a Cambridge economist in the 60s that the only thing worse than exploitation is not being exploited. And I completely believe that, being in Nepali, observing people leaving for working in worse conditions, you can imagine, where death is a real possibility, and still people living in hordes. must be something that drives people to do that. So then that point. Second thing, small, higher value added products, very much so, which again further reinforces the point that you need to get those core constraints addressed, because you need very high levels of standards, because it's going to be agro-based products, your niche products. So you need to have very good infrastructure to get your standards right. If you want to get your goods to foreign markets quickly, airlines can be a good possibility, but then you need very good logistical handling services, good flight connections. For example, you can't get goods from Nepal to Europe on a single flight. It has to go via Middle East. Your products might depreciate or perish on the route. So these things become even more of an issue.
All right, thank you. And Frans, sort of on donors and aid for trade area. So of course, donors can do a lot of different things in to support value chain development in different types of countries. They can think about infrastructure, logistics, trade facilitation. They could also try and help the countries to reap the benefits from it more, so the spillover effects, capture the spillover effects. They can maybe support networking amongst countries. Think about state-business relations, how to help further the state-business relations. They can do a range of things. What works best? What do you think they should be going into in order to support countries to benefit from trade?
Well, I think the question was in a way also a little bit more generic. You've had for a very long time this focus and discussion in the donor community. Should you focus your money on those programs which have a direct poverty impact or an indirect poverty impact, i.e. generates economic growth, trickle down, creates a better competitive environment, jobs. I think 10, 15 years ago it was very much on this direct poverty impact programs, the Millennium Development Goals as an expression of it. You now see in the discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals that economic growth, infrastructure, and those jobs and those kind of things are mentioned as goals. You see in the donor support that more money is being provided for those kind of projects, and this is combined with a discussion which is also taking place here in the United Kingdom, but also in the country where I'm from, the Netherlands, and also in the Nordics, this desire to engage the own private sector again in development cooperation, which is something which didn't happen for a very long time for very good reasons, because the way these businesses were involved was very much through tying your aid, which we all know is a less effective form of aid. I do think it's very important that these lead firms and that private sector in OECD countries is engaged with the private sector in development countries, but it is happening. It's the nuts you eat from Nepal in your supermarket. Malawi. And a lot of these things are happening. It's vegetables from East Africa, it's flowers, it is. And I think their donors have a very important role to play in helping these local producers adhere to standards. And this is also where you see that private sector is helping, by helping these producers to adhere to standards. I think they can help in engaging and bringing and creating employment for women. And you see ITC is very effective in setting up those kind of programs. And I do believe that yes, there is still a problem, and there are sometimes horrific accidents happen in these global value chains in Bangladesh and so. But what you see is that more and more of these lead firms feel more responsible for their subcontractors. Where initially they tried to get away with it's not my business because it's a subcontractor. Now businesses don't get away with it. H&M doesn't get away with saying, well, it's not my problem anymore. So I do think that these firms really help in improving circumstances, which still are not the way we would like to see them, but it's a process.
Okay. So there's a convergence of objectives, donors and business both gearing towards better.
We hope.
Programs. We hope. You're from the OECD. You should know whether they're effective or not. Very good. So let's go to the near final, the final round of quick questions, if there are any around. Yeah. No, you don't. I also have questions. I have more questions, but ask a question.
Maybe, sorry, I can just maybe add to the point about donors and business working with firms or companies in developing countries. I think the process needs to be broadened, because what tends to happen is they work with what are leading companies in those countries. So if you are talking about poverty reduction and benefiting a lot more people, you need to go beyond the people they've been dealing with. You're not going to Malawi, they're probably dealing with one of the more established firms or companies in Malawi. So if you are going to spread it so that it benefits more Malawans, you need to think about beyond those people they've been dealing with. That, of course, is partly a function of government policies. So it's not really a question of what donors can do.
Okay, very good. The final question comes from online. So there was a question from Raluca Nikaora from Dublin, and there's a question about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and in particular whether Japan's joining the TPP negotiations will have a positive effect on Asian trade. Maybe turn it into a more general question about the impact of trade policy and regional integration, and the extent to which regional integration helps developing countries to take part in value chains, and what particular areas in trade policy negotiation need to be addressed in order to help countries benefit from value chains, and is there maybe also a third country effects for those who are not part? So if it helps Asian trade, maybe the TPP, but what about African countries, for example? Are they part? So if you want to answer that question about trade negotiations and trade policy, Ganesh, and then if others also want to think about their final point, then we round off because it's nearly 3 o'clock.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very pertinent question about trade policy and value chains in general. And the short answer, I think, is that the trade policy negotiations around the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership are very important, because at the moment the WTO still is in a deadlock, and we are finding even on the trade facilitation agreement some pushback. So even the minimal thing the Doha round would have achieved seems to be in doubt. Unilateral liberalization has kind of stopped. So these mega regional agreements are the way, in one way, one may get some kind of liberalization going forward. And the two big agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is led by the US, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership led by the People's Republic of China, with Japan in it as well, can eventually be sources of liberalization for the future, and both are very important for the region. The kind of areas we need to cover would be the non-tariff measures in particular. We need to cover investment rules, we need to cover ultimately government procurement, competition, standards, and eventually intellectual property. And I think these are the things we need to look at, particularly if we want value chains to move. And the issue of Japan, if Japan was not in the TPP negotiation, the TPP would not be very much. And this is what the simulation studies show, because the TPP would have been the US, which is a massive economy in the world, with a lot of very small countries, and the benefits, quite frankly, would not have been very much. So Japan joining really made the TPP a viable proposition. So that's something we've got to keep in our mind. The challenge will be for Japan and its adjustment around some of the sensitive sectors, particularly agriculture, and how Japan does that. On the issue of outsiders, the simulation studies that we know about don't tell us very much, because they say that insiders gain, outsiders lose little. But clearly there's some trade diversion that may come about. But a lot of it will depend on how these agreements are done, and what kind of open accession policies there are, and the kind of development provisions we need to put into them. So that's the short answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jody, any final point?
Well, in relation to Cambodia and the TPP, I'm not sure if they've taken a decision. I'm not sure if they're involved, actually. But I do know that there are severe negotiating capacity constraints. And they're negotiating ASEAN, they're still trying to implement commitments, and then on top of that now you have this new mega regional, and I don't think all of the implications have been thought through or analysed, and that is because of capacity constraints.
Okay, Yurendra?
Sure. Can I just make a general point?
Sure.
It has to be on TPP.
No, you're called. It has to be in half a minute.
Okay, I think I just want to say two quick things. One is I think we've got to move out from this way of looking at world in dichotomies, tied aid versus not tied aid. I think there's a whole middle range that exists in between. So it does not need to be free aid versus tied aid, and those are the only two options you can get. And second is, for me, these value chains are also about, the way I look at it is as ecosystems. So there's enough space for everyone to take part. So there's role for producers, activists, people advocating rights issues, fair trade things, and as well as donors addressing specific problems in the countries. So you can do that. One thing that we didn't touch on, and I think is quite important, perhaps even TPP, is the way the origin of a product is defined, or rules of origin, will have a lot of implications on whether an LDC participates or not in global value chains. Let me end with that.
Okay, and Frans, you got the last.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very kind. It's a pity that we can't continue this discussion about whether you are a little bit pregnant or completely pregnant. I want to make 3 points. Is global value chain a new phenomenon? No, I don't think it's a new phenomenon, but I do think what is new is the pace and pattern of it. That's quite new. Is it something that can be replicated? Yes, I think it can be replicated, but don't try to look for the most complicated manufacturing. Look for agriculture, look for services. There it's probably much easier to get the framework conditions right. Final point, is it good? Is it good for the poor? Yes, I think it's very good for the poor. I mean, it's very difficult to make these relationships, to establish these relationships beyond any doubt. We had the same thing with trade liberalization for a long time. But I think if you look at the prevalent mode of production, which in my view is global value chain, and the impressive rise of out of poverty of large groups, especially in Southeast Asia, I think there is some sort of correlation which we eventually ODI will discover with very impressive econometric analysis. And that's my final point. We probably need to do a lot more studies, and this is good for ODI because they're in the business of doing studies. And thank you very much for inviting me.
On that note, on the study, can I point you to the DAGRP website, DFDRC Growth Research Program. There's a publication is forthcoming on enhancing productivity change in the Bangladesh's garment sector, and it discusses the contributions to a meeting we organized in Bangladesh on where we brought together the trade industry minister and the opposition leader for the first time after the election. So it's thinking about the political stability issues about value chains as well, and thinking through what could be done to upgrade and to support the garment sector. And highlighting some new academic research on the importance of productivity and different productivity dispersion across firms, across sectors in an economy. So that will appear on the website. But most importantly, everything that has been discussed today will be on the website as well. Your questions and of course the presentations that we've all or everyone has benefited from will appear on the website. So the presentations and the PowerPoints. So please do have a look once we've got it on in a couple of days, I think, and please do come again to one of our next meetings. And thanks very much for the speakers. So Yurendra, Jody, but in particular Frans for coming over from Paris, and Ganesh for coming over once more from Tokyo. Thank you very much, Ganesh.